And at the last meeting about 3 weeks ago that I attended in Dusseldorf, told me I didn't know anything I was talking about to the whole meeting because he doesn't like me, and about nutritional reference values, and we'll get into that. And then in the Codex meetings on the sides are these kind of areas here where the non-governmental organizations sit and the governmental organizations sit. And then up in the peanut section are members of the public. And any of you could go and attend the meeting if you wanted to. You couldn't speak out at the meeting as we could. You couldn't submit written documents as we can, but you can at least observe what's going on. But they do discourage that. They do discourage that. So who do you have at these meetings? You have, and I've already gone through a little bit of this, the chairman and the Codex staff. You have the national governments. And remember when I was talking about the delegate from Albania to Zimbabwe, and by the way, I can't ever remember seeing a Belgian representative there. You are talking about bureaucrats. You're talking about unelected functionaries who probably were never elected to a job in their lives, but yet profess to represent your interests. Now, the person at these meetings who professes to represent your interests as consumers is a gentleman named Basil Mafidakis from Brussels, who's a Greek guy who's been living in Brussels for a good number of years, and told me in one of my many arguments over the years on the floor with him that he represented the interests of consumers, and I told him I had the temerity to tell him he didn't, and to tell him that in public. Because I was so sick and tired of him, he was actually giving instructions to the chairman, to Rolf Grossklaus, in front of the whole group, the committee, saying, you need to do this, you have to do this, and then the chairman would do it. They were joined at the hip, just like this. Then there are the INGOs, international non-governmental organizations, like the National Health Federation. And we had been attending Codex meetings since the mid-90s, however, only as members of the press. Then in the year 2000, I got the brilliant idea, since I was living in the south of France, I said, why don't I go to one of these Codex meetings? It's in Berlin, I'll go to the committee meeting, I'll get to be on the US delegation, I'll sign up and go. And the then president of the National Health Federation, a lovely woman named Maureen Solomon, said, yes, do it. So I did, stayed with friends. It was really a very cheap trip. But I found out something very interesting. Sitting on the national delegation, you might as well be, I don't know if you have this expression here, but a bump on a log. You can't say anything. You even have to sign a piece of paper that promises that you will not try to lobby any delegation, other delegation, unless it's the U.S. position. And I'm pretty sure they have other countries have the same type of form. In any event, I was able to make an impact at the first meeting regardless, but it's very, very tough. So in the third year, the U.S. delegate got tired of me because I was so outspoken, I was such a troublemaker. She wouldn't let me on the U.S. delegation, but it was the best thing that ever could have happened to me. Because then I went out and I got the National Health Federation accredited as an official organization. They turned me down many times, but I kept persisting, and within an 8-week period, I was in. And so then I was able, thank you very much, I was able to start speaking out. And the interesting thing that I almost forgot to tell you is most of these INGOs are just trade organizations, the World Sugar Research Organization, the International Dairy Foundation, or Federation, excuse me, representing commercial interests. I would say there are only a handful that represent consumers, and most of those don't really represent consumers except in a very, very narrow interest, like IDFAM that represents or claims to represent interests of consumers on infant baby formulas. IFACO is the same thing. And then there's Consumers International, which is actually virulently anti-nutrient, anti-supplement, and we used to have big battles against Consumers International, as well as the European Commission representative, Matthew Dawkins, at these Codex meetings. So it's usually just us and the South African delegate arguing for health freedom. That was it. Us two, and against the rest of the committee. And then, as I mentioned, members of the public are there very rarely, press almost never. So I would submit to you, though, that Codex is a noble concept. It was started maybe for malevolent reasons, but the stated intention of it is twofold. One, to eliminate barriers to international barriers to trade, and number two was to protect the health of the consumer. Well, who could object to that? That's perhaps a noble concept if it's applied. But the problem is that these people have an elitist, top-down driven agenda. It's not about from the bottom up. It's not grassroots. It's top-down driven. Very pro-drug, very anti-natural remedies and supplements, very anti-free market. It's not about voluntary exchanges between people. It's about corporatism. It's about protecting that unholy marriage between big business and big government, which is what they want to keep. And not worst of all, but equally bad, it's creakingly slow to react to changes. This is the problem, no matter how noble an institution is with the government, no matter how well-intentioned. You can assume that these are the best people, angels on earth, running these agencies, but it doesn't matter. They're still going to kill people. You know, the FDA, it's been calculated by Dirk Pearson and Sandy Shaw, who ran the numbers, that the FDA in the U.S. has killed more Americans than all the wars that the U.S. ever fought in, from the time of the Revolutionary War up to the Gulf War. The FDA is responsible for more deaths in the U.S. The problem, in part at least, is these agencies are creakingly slow to react to change. And I'll give you an example. At a very recent Codex meeting in Canada, Codex Committee on Food Labeling, there was the Canadian delegate. They've been debating a standard that the FAO and WHO had established in 2004. Well, here we are 5 years later. The Canadian delegate very sensibly raised her flag and was recognized by the chairman to talk, and she presented an alternative, which was some recent data that had come out, and I forget now what the standard was that they were working on, but it almost doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is she had more recent data, but it was universally rejected by everyone except for the Canadian and myself, who spoke up in defense of her, because they had older data that came from the parent organizations, FAO, WHO. And so they wanted to go with that. Well, that's who we have to go with. So to enact a change, you know, with the doubling time of knowledge in human society, you know, it's increasing logarithmically. What we know today compared to what we knew in the year 2000 has increased logarithmically. And what we knew in 2000 compared to 1800s is just as much, although it's increasing even more year by year. So for them to set these standards in literally, almost literally, stone, at least hardened clay, you know, they'll be debating gas lighting standards while we were powering our homes with cold fusion. So they'll always be behind the times. So how many people will die because of their outdated standards? This is the problem with Codex. Indeed, this is the problem with the European Union or the United States or Canada or any government agency. They're always going to be behind the times. And even worse, it's all based on junk science. What you have are risk assessment, they use these fancy terms, risk assessment, risk analysis, risk management, they go through the whole laundry list. But when the tire meets the road, what they're really doing is they're applying a toxicological model that's meant to be applied for drugs and man-made chemicals that were just created in a synthetic laboratory somewhere and are being released upon the population. That's what they're meant to be applied for, not natural products that we've evolved with over thousands of years. This is something that you don't need to spend the time and energy and money on to prove that they're safe. And I take you back to that chart. Meteorites and lightning strikes. Where do natural remedies fall? They fall right between those two things. Do we really need to spend millions, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars to prove these things are safe that we've evolved with, that I can't even put enough greats in front of grandparents to say how long ago they were getting vitamin A, vitamin D, and the like. And so what they're doing is they're suppressing, they're removing from the marketplace the competition to the drug products. And they're creating these standards and guidelines that are based upon junk science. And one bit of proof in this is at the last meeting at Codex, I talked to a gentleman who used to be head of FAO for many years, and he was telling me how the FAO and WHO expert consultations have changed. Now these are the groups that come up with the data that are applied by Codex. And what they used to do up until 1999 is FAO and or WHO would select a broad-based group of people to render expert opinions. They would get people over here who represented just various opinions that were not always in agreement. But now, since 1999, what they decided to do for the last 10 years is they know what's best for all of us, so they have a predetermined outcome. So now they're selecting people. They will go and they'll pick Willem here, and they'll say, oh, Willem will side with us, so we're going to have him. They'll pick Chantal here, because Chantal will side with us too. She has the same view. They won't pick Ian because Ian, he's a little, funny guy. He may not go our way. They'll pick Tom over here because maybe Tom will go our way. So anyway, they pick, and I don't mean this, all of you would be against their way, I'm sure. But anyway, the point being made is that they hand select their groups, and this is what their supposedly scientific opinion is coming out of. But science is nothing but politics, really, these days. It's not science. It's whatever they want it to be. But they wave it like a cross, like they used to do in the Middle Ages. Oh, you see the cross, so you bow down. But all it is just a mirage. It's just an illusion. And so with this junk science, they're creating the vitamin mineral food supplement guidelines, which is just a shell at this stage. It hasn't been filled in. They still have to fill in the numbers. And that's what they're working on. And this will come into effect generally probably in the next 3 or 4 years. They're working on GM food labeling, something we've been opposing. We've been supporting GM food labeling, but we've been opposing the United States and Canada at the Canadian meetings. Interesting thing, at these meetings, for the last 5 years that we've been going, they've been in a stalemate. In this committee meeting, the Europeans are on our side, or we're on their side, because they want foods to be labeled as GM foods. If you get a container, and on it doesn't say anything, what will the consumer think? So it's very important for the consumer to be educated and informed that when they're eating, they can make an educated choice. That's what the Europeans are arguing at the Codex Committee meeting on food labeling. That's what NHF is arguing. That's what actually a lot of the third world is arguing. But guess who are our opponents? You'd never guess in a million years. It's the ones who want to export their crops, their grain, their GM crops to Europe, to the third world. That's Canada, that's the United States, that's Mexico, that's Argentina, Costa Rica, Australia, and New Zealand. They all form a little block, and at the meetings, it's very carefully orchestrated. You can see it. Canadian delegate pops up and says, oh, we don't need GM food labeling. The American delegate then speaks up and says, oh, the Canadian is so smart. Yes, we don't need food labeling. It's just ridiculous. In fact, the American delegate told me to my face, Barbara Schneeman, she said, the average consumer is too ignorant to understand what GM food labeling means. That's why we don't want it, because they'll make the wrong choice. They won't choose our food. That's why it can't be there. And then the Argentinian will speak up in Spanish, and it'll be translated into whatever one of the official languages people are listening to, and will support the U.S. position, and Australia, New Zealand the same way. And this gives you a prime example of how these government agencies don't represent consumer interests, because in a recent poll in the United States, 88% of the Americans supported having GM food labeling, 88%. And yet here's the U.S. delegate taking this hard position in favor of Monsanto and these other GM crop growing people to oppose it. I think that what we really need to do is we need to get a campaign together to force them to adhere to what the Americans want and the Canadians want, the Argentinians almost certainly want as well. You have the same problem at the Codex Committee meeting on food additives, the host country being China, in Beijing, that I went to. I didn't go to the last one this year, but I went to the one the year before. I was the only one to argue against aspartame being approved